Today we're going to begin a study of Paul's letters to two young preachers. Paul wrote probably 13 books of the New Testament. In a lot of ways, Hebrews doesn't sound like Paul. And so there's a lot of discussion about who wrote Hebrews. Whether some people suggest Paul, and there are numerous other suggestions. I suppose the only way you're going to find out is get to heaven eventually, work your way around to Paul and ask him, and then he can tell you. But there's no way for us to determine who wrote Hebrews. But at any rate, Paul wrote certainly 13 books of the New Testament, 27, more than anybody else. Now, was it more words than anybody else? The answer is no. So if it wasn't Paul, who would it have been? I'm waiting.
John.
No. Luke. Because Luke wrote the two longest books of the New Testament, Luke and Acts. So he had more words, not many more, but Paul had a lot more books. And most of Paul's books were relatively generic. I mean, you had Romans, which was the most generic, then to specific churches. He wrote 4 books to specific people, 3 people. 2 books to Timothy, 1 to Titus, 1 to Philemon. Timothy and Titus were valuable helpers for Paul. And he sent them to places where he wasn't, with instructions to them as to what they needed to teach. And they did that well. And their books contained teaching that was critical to the recipients then, and critical to us today. Well worthy of study. So let's start with the one that comes first in the series and the longest of the books, 1 Timothy. And as is typical of really most books in the New Testament, the date of writing, the place of writing are uncertain. There are good indications that 1 Timothy was written from Macedonia. More hints, really, for location than for the date. In 1 Timothy 1 and verse 3, as I urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, so that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine. So that was the focus, right teaching. That was the focus of the message. And Paul left Timothy in Ephesus. They were there together. And then Paul went on, Timothy stayed. And so there's a good possibility that this was at the end or near the end of the 3rd missionary journey. Because in the 3rd journey, Paul spent most of his time in Ephesus. This is in Acts chapter 19. He taught in a synagogue for 3 months. And then he rented some space from a man named Tyrannus, and he taught there for 2 years. And sometime later, when he meets with the elders from Ephesus in Acts chapter 20, he mentions laboring for 3 years there. Now, it's possible that Paul took 2 years and 3 months and he just rounded up to 3 because it was part of 3. That could be. But it's probably more likely that he spent part of that time, some of the missing 9 months, traveling elsewhere. And it was then that he left Timothy in Ephesus. And it was right after Ephesus that he went to Macedonia. That's from Acts 20 and verse 1. What happened at the end of Acts chapter 19? Well, you remember this riot. The silver shrines, little houses that were being made to Diana, or Artemis, if you like that word, the goddess of the Ephesians, and the riot led by a man called Demetrius, saying that if this man Paul gets much more influence, fellas, our income's going to go down. So they had a riot, and that was eventually quelled by the town clerk, who told them, you know, if you have a complaint, go to the courts, but if we keep staying out here like this, the authorities aren't going to be happy. And so he told them, go home, and they did. And right after that, Paul left, went to Macedonia. Probably this was about AD 58 or 59. Don't know precisely, but that's a good guess. Really, the date for 1 Timothy hinges upon whether there was one imprisonment or two. I think the general feeling, I think it's safe to say most of you would understand it this way, that there were two. At the end of Acts, Paul is in prison to some degree in Rome. He was in custody, let's say, because he wasn't living in a jail. He was living in a house, which unfortunately, this is the worst of deals. You are confined, but you have to provide your own housing with your own money. He had to pay for the place that he was confined in. Had to pay rent. And he lived there for 2 years. He had quite a bit of freedom. He always had a Roman soldier with him. But he had people who were coming to see him. He was teaching them. Good freedom, but not entirely. Suggested dates for that are about AD 60 through 62. So this would be right after that third journey. Timothy was with him. You see that in the salutations of 3 of the books that were written then. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon were all written during that time. And Timothy is mentioned in the salutation in Philippians 1:1, Colossians 1:1, and Philemon 1. And in the closings of Colossians and Philemon, there's another faithful co-worker of Paul who is mentioned. His name is Demas. What happened to Demas? What'd you say, Jim? He left. Yeah, Demas may have decided, based upon our sermon that we had today, maybe the cost was too high, and he gave up. We will read that in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 10. He didn't remain faithful, but the others apparently did. At the end of Acts, it's a positive scene. In Philippians chapter 1, it seems very positive because Paul is indicating there that he expects to be released from prison. He almost certainly was. And so we would say that there were 2 imprisonments. This first one that ended well, he was released. Then there was a second one And it was at that time that 2 Timothy was written, and that one ended with his death. I think it's likely that 1 Timothy was written after the third journey. Some people suggest that maybe it was written while he was actually at Ephesus, either there, and he just left this behind for Timothy to use as a guide, or maybe as he was kind of traveling around elsewhere during those 9 months not accounted for, that he wrote back. His intention apparently was to go back to Ephesus. In 1 Timothy 3, verse 14, "These things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly. But if I'm delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God." He intended to come back. And I think an early date fits better because Paul is writing about Timothy's youth. And don't let people look down on you because you're young. If the book was written late, and some people suggest about 64 to 65, which would be 5 years or so later, it wouldn't seem as appropriate to be talking about a youth who was probably at that time about 30. So an early date seems to fit better. Some people object to an early date because they say that Paul wouldn't have spent 3 years in Ephesus without appointing elders. But there's nothing in 1 Timothy that indicates that Timothy had to appoint elders. Titus was in Crete to appoint elders. Nothing is told to Timothy about appointing them. What we have in 1 Timothy 3 is the qualifications, and they are presented. But he doesn't tell Timothy, now appoint elders there based on this. Easily possible that they were already there. And so probably Paul was released from that imprisonment in Acts 28. He had a period of freedom that could have been several years long. And then he was rearrested. And I said, some people say it was written later. There's an old book, J.D. Davis, his Dictionary of the Bible, and he says AD 64 to 65, which is certainly possible. Again, you'll have to ask Paul. There is a period of freedom that is alluded to, and probably actually happened. Paul desired, from Romans 15:24, to go to another country, Spain. And Clement of Rome, who wrote about the time that John wrote the book of Revelation, hinted that Paul got there. And there is a document, it's a fragment that lists most of the New Testament books. It's the oldest known list. It's called the Muratory Fragment. And it was compiled about AD 170. It went missing for 1,600 years. And it was found in a library in Milan, Italy in 1740. Now, how these things can happen, I don't know. But you always read about people, who happen to go to a garage sale and they find a painting by Picasso that they bought for $10 and sold for $2 million. That did happen just a few years ago, and it was at a garage sale. So if you go to a garage sale, keep your eyes open because you may find a treasure. The Muratory Fragment was found in 1740. Interestingly enough, there are 4 books that are not mentioned in it. And all of them were books that had doubts expressed about them as to whether they should be included in the New Testament. Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter. They all wound up there, and I think we're glad for that. But there were doubts expressed, and so they were not in that fragment. So David said AD 64 to 65 for writing 1 Timothy. If so, that would have been nearing the end, because the suggested date for Paul's execution was AD 67. History does record it as being in the 14th year of Nero. And Nero became emperor in AD 54. So the 14th year, during the 14th year, would have been 67. You know from reading 2 Timothy chapter 4, where Paul said, I am ready to be offered. He knew that his death was coming soon. We have prisons that people may be in a long time. I have been studying with one of our prison students for close to 20 years. He is 66 years old. He has been in prison for 45 years. The Romans didn't do that. We have prisons as punishment, yes, as protection for society, yes. I mean, it's handy that rapists and murderers are confined and not on your doorstep. That works. We also, to some degree, you can question how much, have them for rehabilitation. A good thing if it works. Generally doesn't, but sometimes it does. Roman prisons weren't like that. A person was in prison mainly because they were being held for trial. And when trial happened and you had a sentence pronounced, we know how sentences pronounced today are, particularly in capital cases. If a person is executed within 10 years, that's amazing. It wasn't that way then. Once they were sentenced to death, they weren't alive very long. You know, maybe days, and the sentence was carried out. So Paul would not have been in prison a long time with this second one. If he is convicted, that's it. And he's going to be executed soon. These books to Timothy and Titus are called pastoral epistles. That's unfortunate. That title first appeared in the 1700s. Ken, do you have something you want to say?
Yes, sir. I have a question.
Let me come back so I can hear you better.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now because I'm close.
You mentioned those 4 books.
Yeah.
But you said should not be in this list?
Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter.
Yes. Why shouldn't they not be? Why does it say it should not be in this list? You mentioned it's already in this list.
I'm coming back. I'm kind of jumping a little ahead of myself, but I have it in my notes based upon Ken's question. about the 4 books that were not in the Muratory Fragment, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter. And he said, why not? One of the major arguments given in support of including a book was references to that book by, well-known members, if we can put it that way, in the early church. There were fewer of those references to these books than to others. And that's one reason. Another reason is that, people may have an axe to grind, and they may not have liked the teaching. Now, I'm jumping later in time, but one book that Martin Luther objected to strenuously was the book of James, because he saw it as conflicting with the book of Romans, with Romans and its emphasis upon grace, and James, where he talks quite a bit about works. And so Luther objected to that. So that's a good part of it, the number of references to them. It is a detailed study that I don't have enough on to undertake right now, but that's part of it. But the question is very valid, and they were discussed, those 4, for a good period of time. But the canon, that's what it's called, C-A-N-O-N, not a cannon that goes boom, was finalized about 325. And it was sort of a work in progress up to that. This book belongs in, this book belongs out. Let's put this book in and take that book out. Things like that happen. But by 325, it was settled. What Paul is doing in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus is he is preparing successor evangelists to himself. He's getting them ready for the work. And when we call them pastoral officials, that is really in keeping with a denominational concept today, in that the pastor leads the church. And if you go to your dictionary and you look up pastor, what you're generally going to find as your first definition is a Christian minister or priest having spiritual charge over a congregation or other group. And there's an old commentary that I have by 3 men named Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown. Excellent commentary. They lived back in the 1800s. They were Presbyterians. And they call Timothy the chairman of the church at Ephesus. Well, is it certainly possible that John Lindell would be called the chairman of James River Assembly? I don't know. I don't know whether they call him that or not. But he is the pastor of James River Assembly. And in most denominational churches, if they have elders, they are subordinate to the pastor. It's a denominational concept. Now, can the preacher as pastor be correct? Absolutely. I'm going to guess that most of you have either been in a congregation or certainly know of one where the preacher was an elder, making him a pastor. So it can be right, but generally throughout the Christian world, it's not, because they are looking at one person when instead a group of elders, of pastors, are the ones who lead the church. I frequently use a study Bible. It's called the Harper Study Bible. Harold Lenzel was the editor. Harold Lenzel, Southern Baptist. He writes about 1 Timothy. Timothy had been assigned to a work which had serious problems. And while the apostle had every confidence in him, he felt that Timothy needed guidance and help if he were to succeed in the oversight of the flock. What does episkopos mean? Overseer, the one who has oversight. And that's one of the three New Testament words that refers to elders. Lenzel is attributing it to Timothy. That responsibility for oversight is the elders, not the preachers. And we see that in Hebrews 13, and we see it in 1 Peter chapter 5. We know that Titus was sent to Crete to appoint elders. Timothy may have appointed elders in Ephesus. We don't know. But whether they appointed them or not doesn't make them superior to the elders they appointed. And that's the denominational concept. So these epistles relate to the office of the ministry, very much so, but not to pastors, elders, as such. We've spent most of our time talking about date and location of writing, and those are uncertain. Authorship, really not. 1 Timothy 1:1, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the commandment of God, our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, our hope. Now, is that definitive, where the book says, Paul, I'm writing this book? Well, it's really not. Writing under the name of a well-known person was common in that time. Various of the apocryphal Gospels and other early Christian writings were attributed to apostles when they weren't really by them. That was just an attempt to lend credence, and it was not like plagiarizing your term paper or your political speech or anything like that today. It wasn't like that. It was just done. And it wasn't considered dishonest to do it. So it's not definitive. But we are confident that Paul wrote this book based upon early references to it, among other things. Now, there are some critics who say, well, it doesn't sound like Paul. It's wordy, was their remark. There's more words here than maybe there were in some of those other books. And the point of view as he expresses it, well, that's not always consistent. Well, when we write something, if we write to our grandmother, whom we really like, as opposed to writing to a business associate who we wish he would go away, are we going to say the same things? Well, probably not. We don't write the same things to everybody. It depends on the person. Same here.
John, do you know about how old he was?
Paul probably was some younger than Jesus, I think.
We were at 65.
Paul would probably have been well in his 50s at the time he wrote this, maybe in his 60s. Oh yeah, Jack says that people died young then. A lot of them did. What is the main reason why the birth rate, not the birth rate, the average age of death in the U.S. has gone up so much? Now, it's kind of plateaued right now, but why has it gone up so much? Fewer people are dying when they were children. Let me encourage you. You've probably already been, and I've mentioned it before. But there is a a well-known cemetery at Diamond, Missouri. And we've been there. It is amazing the number of children who died at 2 and 3 and 4 years old. What did they generally die of? Probably smallpox. There's much less of that today, and that's why the average lifespan has gone up. But did people live a long time? Well, talk to Methuselah. Yes, they did. If they got through those early years, they may well live to be as old as some of us today. I mean, the Apostle John, probably in his 90s when he died. Could the age be a factor in the type of writing? Absolutely. Now, Paul, being probably, late 50s or 60 when he wrote 1 Timothy, his writing style would be pretty well established. But as it gets older, and I think this is illustrated in that well-known story that is talked about in John, who was almost certainly a member of the church at Ephesus, and they would ask him to say a few words. Well, you've heard that. I mean, he was old. He might have had to get help to stand up. And what would he say? Little children, love one another. What was John and James, what were they known as during the ministry of Jesus? Sons of thunder. So do you think that John's attitude changed over those 60 plus years? Yeah. Age affected it. Some people object to Paul as the writer because they say that these false doctrines that Timothy has been told to address belong to the 2nd century. Well, that's not true. Gnosticism was coming into play in the 1st century, and that wasn't the only false doctrine that was being taught. Actually, the primary warning that was given in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 23, is against senseless, time-wasting controversy. Could we have senseless, time-wasting controversy? Well, maybe if we spent 2 hours arguing over whether Paul wrote Hebrews, would that be senseless? Probably not. You could study a lot, and you can come up with good arguments. Paul wrote Hebrews, or Paul didn't write Hebrews. Apollos wrote it, or somebody else. That could be time well spent. But there can be arguments that are worthless. If we spend a long, long time arguing over whether we should drink out of one communion cup or multiple cups, that is becoming worthless. Although that has split churches, as you're well aware. And certainly it's true that what is senseless to one person can be very significant to another. And we may think, that doesn't make any difference. And somebody else could say, oh, yes, it does. It's a big deal. It varies, depending on your point of view. And so Romans 14, 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 10, all emphasize to us that there will be disagreements. How should they be addressed? With patience, mutual respect, and love. That's how we should address those things. And if that person thinks it's a big deal, we shouldn't belittle them. We shouldn't holler at them. We shouldn't point our fingers at them and say, you need to learn more Scripture. We need to teach as we understand and give them time. And maybe they will come around to our point of view, and maybe they won't. But as long as it does not become a divisive manner, it's okay. Let them have their point of view. And another objection that's raised to Paul is church organization. And some commentators say, well, that organized church belongs to a later period. Well, it depends on what we call organization. In the first journey, Acts chapter 14, verse 23, Paul went on his circuit. He came around this way and he came over to here. And then he went back that way. And what did he do on his return trip? Appointed elders in every church. So they had elders. And it may be that the organization that they are talking about is that organization, that hierarchy that came later. That was not a positive development. Because the organization, ideally, of every congregation is that it be led by elders. Is it always possible? No. But generally it's possible. And if it's possible, it should be. And the congregation, the church, is independent. But when you started having the bishop of Smyrna, the bishop of Ephesus, they were the lead bishop. Well, now we need a layer over them. And you keep going, and you keep adding layers, and all of a sudden, who do you have? You have the Pope of Rome. Not a positive development. If that's the organization that they are talking about, they are incorrect. Then there were some people who objected to Paul, saying, well, these are just fragments of letters to this person and that person and another person, and they were all put together by somebody, and they made their way into Scripture. Well, the Bible claims to be a whole, a unity. And if it is assembled on that basis, it undermines the truthfulness of the whole book. And so the New Bible Commentary said, any theory which postulates that genuine fragments were incorporated into fictitious epistles raises more problems than it solves. And the differences, perhaps, between these books and others that Paul wrote can be explained. Certainly, Timothy knew Paul very well. He knew what Paul liked to do. He knew what Paul didn't like. He knew Paul's thinking. And so in the books to Timothy, there's less emphasis on doctrine because it's not really needed. Romans is heavenly doctrinal, not these books, because of the recipient. And whether or not an amanuensis was used. Paul was getting older. Some people speculate his eyesight was not too good. Nancy probably thinks if I write something in cursive, I need an amanuensis. I can barely read some of the cursive notes that I've written right here. But I can read one that I wrote in. Tertius wrote Romans for Paul. Tertius was the amanuensis. Acts 16 and verse 22. Well, it could be that the relative freedom, whether it was more or less, that Paul gave to Tertius and the other people who wrote for him, that could be a factor in how the book is written. Who knows? Maybe Tertius was wordy. And so you get a longer book. That's possible. But these books were widely accepted, coming back to Ken's statement earlier, widely accepted by church fathers. And that's a strong argument for authenticity. Clement of Rome, we referred to him earlier, saying that Paul went to Spain. He quotes from 1 Timothy, and he did that before AD 100. And then you have portions of 1 Timothy appearing in some fragments that are left over from the 2nd century. Those things, affirmation by church leaders, references in other documents, were proofs of authenticity, and they were used in developing the New Testament as we have it. Next week, we will talk a little bit more personally about Timothy and probably get into chapter 1.